Welcome, everybody. We're here on a special little gathering today. We've got SGAnon in the house, Becky O from Truth Seekers in the Hood, and we also have Dale here, and Pirate from Chats with Aussies. And we've got some very exciting news to break today on an affidavit that SG has provided us prior to the recording. We've done a little bit of a look-see around what's going on in and around this document. So we're going to be focusing on that, and Becky's going to be sharing it on the screen for us shortly. Welcome, SG. How did you get this document?
Well, it's fascinating. Thank you for having me back. And, I've noticed in this process that as we move further along, this drippage from the background into the foreground, almost like a merging or a blending, if you will, is beginning to come to the online digital and alternative media space. The legacy media is essentially dead, and pretty much I think all of the legacy media outlets would spurn any type of whistleblower material provided to them by any source that didn't characterize and follow the caricature of a very precise, certain narrative and agenda. And I think in some regards, you've got a lot of other voices out there in this digital age now that have, gained pretty significant clout and notoriety, things like Dan Bongino, Tucker Carlson, etc. And there are certain types of whistleblower documents that I don't think they would be willing to accept at their face value, and that which are very hard to establish certain validity and legitimacy. And we should open the conversation today by saying that the document I received from a masked email address, while it's difficult to establish full validity, it certainly sounds exactly like the type of scenario that you would be engaged in if you were a special or clandestine military operation seeking to destabilize the deep state component of control here in the United States of America. And we'll get into that here in just a minute. But it was provided as a document dump, and I was not the only. There was a BCC list on the email chain, so I'm sure that I wasn't the only recipient of the same. And I think the question out there for a lot of people is, what do we do with it once we have it? I feel an obligation to share it when the background and the pedigree seems very compelling. This is not the only document that I've received. There's been several documents that have totaled more than 140 pages worth of information that has been compiled with regards to these alleged audits being conducted by Joint Special Operations Command here in the United States of America domestically. And so this particular document, being one of the easier ones to digest, I thought it would be appropriate to bring it to the fore on a channel that wasn't, primarily originating in the United States of America and would have a more international and a more Commonwealth realms kind of reach, because it helps to unify everyone on the progress so far. The big question from patriots all over the world is, where are we at with respect to this or with respect to that? Where are we at with the movement of the dollar, with the collapse of the U.S. corporate system? Where are we at, with the destabilization of the English crown? Has the royal family actually been taken out? Are we seeing, essentially buffoonery and pantomime in some regards? And the answer, I think, is absolutely yes. And with regards to the progress, we have what sounds like and what appears to be a longitudinal case study being conducted within the United States of America, pointed primarily at members of the U.S. judiciary system.
Yeah, right. Please don't send us any more documents at the moment. This one was just, we've been going hardcore on it. We've been researching from all sides of it. So thank you for sharing that document with us.
I find it fascinating
Absolutely.
Sorry, SJ, I find it fascinating that you get provided these documents. Meanwhile, we've just witnessed on a global scale of the failure of the court system over in the US, what Trump's just experienced. So it's coming very public to normal people. And, ironically, this has all come out at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Timely. So.
Okay, so let's hit it off. SJ, did you want me to share the screen and get this beautiful document up?
Let's go right ahead.
Okay, so you can see that.
And that's the end of it. So sorry, we were digging earlier.
Gonna...
go back up to the top. Can you scroll? Or
yeah, I'm just going to move our little thing so I can scroll up. Okay, so here we go. Go ahead, SG.
So let's take it from the top. What we have here is an affidavit of fact and a notice of default judgment. Of course, by the title, it's pretty obvious out there. A default judgment happens when a case, essentially when one party in a case has been providing the other party with ongoing updates, progress, status reports, requests for comment, requests for interaction, etc. And all of those inroads are sort of spurned or ignored. There's non-response. There's no counterfiling that's conducted. There's no contention to the facts that's provided. It's sort of like it's just ignored. And so then as a result of that, excuse me, under US law, a default judgment then takes effect. And essentially the court says, well, you're not arguing your side. So that in and of itself is an acceptance of the postulations and the stipulations that have been put forward. And on this particular document, we see that the sureties of the peace, I'm assuming, who are listed in the upper left, are operating in terra firma jurisdiction. So that's jurisdiction of the natural law. That's jurisdiction of the earth. That's a sovereign being under the living God. And remember, the U.S. Supreme Court has actually adjudicated in court record, I want to say it was in the early 1900s, that the law emanates from the sovereign, and the sovereign are the people. They're the American people, we the people. Ostensibly the affidavit is being served to or within some sort of county combined court, and incorporated is put on the end of that. So that highlights the fact that we're dealing with a foreign jurisdiction. We're dealing with a corporatized bureaucratic jurisdiction and not a common constitutional law-based jurisdiction. And that's a distinct arena that we have to talk about, because that separation, that blending, is the basis, I think, for this document and probably hundreds of thousands of others of similar documents, provided that this one is in fact valid. And again, like we stated earlier, it's difficult to establish that validity with things like this. But we have an acting judge that's been identified with regards to this notice of default judgment, and a registration number, a foreign, probably a Dun & Bradstreet registration number to a foreign power. It's been blacked out. And so the document starts off by acknowledging that we are the sureties of the peace, and we accept the pleas of guilt to multiple counts of extensive fraud, felony treason, and all other crimes as detailed in sworn witness testimonies contained within the following documents. All exhibits and documents filed on record in each case are acknowledged as facts. So, we've been presenting these documents. This proceeding has been ongoing. You've chosen not to participate in that, but that does not mean that these proceedings just stop. And from that non-participation, we now acknowledge that the things that have been postulated are in fact factual. And we have, a large area blacked out. Those are probably the exhibits and various specific things that have been filed along in the predating of this notice of default judgment. Let's move down the screen just a little bit. So we have, for the record, all exhibits listed above are filings that remain uncontested. So again, this is a non-response situation, and the hubris that is expressed by the deep state and those cronies, even at the community level, and the Australians probably know this better than anyone in the Western world, that the hubris and the just the very sheer arrogance, almost like a malintended arrogance expressed on behalf of certain agents of we the people, who have actually begun acting as officers and representatives of a foreign government. They often are not going to believe something like this, right? You present a document like this to them, or a stipulation of facts, and they sort of tell you, well, you have to come back and do it in our court system. And that's not actually how this works, and has never been how constitutional law works. A citizen's affidavit has always been enough, generally with one person contending and two or more witnesses, has always been enough in decades and centuries past to move the common law grand jury process along. It would at least allow the grand jury to impanel itself and review the evidence if the local sheriff office chose not to review the evidence of their own volition. That's going to take us a little far off record here. Coming back to this, having been given sufficient notice and time, failed to respond, object, or rebut each statement, both publicly and privately. Consequently, each statement within these exhibits stands as fact and law, and is recognized as a debt instrument against someone. The conduct of the judicial employee consistently violates Colorado constitutional law and its relevant codes. Thus, we accept each guilty plea as documented in the record. We hereby acknowledge your plea of guilt to the charges of severe human rights abuses and corruption perpetrated against someone, his family, and the general populace. said actions constitute violations under the ongoing national emergency pursuant to Executive Order 13818, as well as extensive breaches of both federal and state constitutional laws, Executive Orders 13773, 13903, and 13923. Furthermore, these acts represent routine infractions of the Universal Commercial Code of 1-308, 18 U.S. Code Section 241 and 242, and 18 U.S. Code Section 245. And then it tells us to refer to exhibits. We acknowledge your admission of guilt to denying the right to a speedy trial, denying the right to a jury trial, exhibiting gross favoritism towards litigants, refusing to review exculpatory evidence, and imposing cruel and unusual punishment through a judgment obtained by both extrinsic and collateral fraud. Refer to Exhibits 2, 3, and 7. Unfortunately, I do not have the exhibits present for our call today. We recognize your guilty plea to charges of fraud, piracy, identity theft, and human trafficking by using the assumed name of someone without consent and unlawfully administering the trust of that person for a period nearing 3 years without permission. So let's stop there really quickly. When we talk about trust and we talk about assumed name, this is where that corporate constitutional maritime common law situation comes into play. We talked about that a moment ago with the terra firma jurisdiction versus the incorporated jurisdiction. So what we have here is we have the assumed name, the corporate fiction, right? The fake personhood of someone that has been leveraged by the judicial court, probably the judge or a member of the or a number of the judicial court or fiscal court executives in the county for profit and fraud. And that is a pretty standard modus operandi, unfortunately, within the U.S. maritime law system, because everyone at birth is assigned a name that goes on a certificate of deposits where you have a birth certificate. And that name is in all capital letters. And so you have been capitalized from the moment that you're born here in the United States system. You're not recognized by the corporate government, the fictitious, fake, phony, and false government, as a living being. You are simply a resource of the corporation. So what we have here is, for a period nearing 3 years, there has been unlawful use of that corporate fiction by this judicial either person or entity itself as a whole. And under the executive orders that President Trump put into place in that first administration, and then many of the executive orders that are still active as a result of specific arenas of U.S. code, including 50 U.S.C., which is the National Securities Act, we have a situation where expanded authority has been provided, and things like human trafficking, severe human rights abuses, and corruption are now capital crimes that can be interceded by both federal law enforcement and the United States military. And so this would qualify, actually, this type of fictitious usury, and that's what it is. It's usury of a personhood, of a fictitious entity as a means to get back at you, the living man, or at you, the living woman. That is piracy and identity theft at its basis. It's also usury of the person, which is a high crime and a misdemeanor outlined in a number of common law and Enlightenment period cases going back to the late 17th century. So, and it tells us to refer to Exhibit 2. Continuing here, we also acknowledge your admission of guilt to administrative fraud in violation of Article 3 and the recent judicial notice in reference to the federal Supreme Court's corrective wisdom, and that's contained in Exhibits 1, 6, and 7. Now, if we go down just a little bit more, we have the quote there, collection of maxims of law for Charles Weisman: he who does a thing by another is considered as doing it himself. So we were just talking about usury a moment ago. The acts of an agent are the acts of the principal. So this is a situation where judicial guidance here in the United States and judicial precedents, sort of the attitude, right, the wisdom of the law here in the United States is that you cannot simply say, I was being told to do it, or it was my duty, or I had no choice. You are acting not only on behalf of the principal, but in effect, you become the principal when you choose to violate and step outside the law if directed to do so. We hereby accept all guilty pleas recorded for conspiring against the American family for financial gain since 2021. By failing to perform or appropriately discharge duties, someone has committed violation under the RICO Act. And then we have a significant redaction there. Pursuant to Chapter 115 of the United States Code concerning treason, sedition, and subversive activities, 18 U.S. Code 2381, The failure to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States and honor your oath of office in the presence of 2 or more witnesses of the same overt act or in open court constitutes capital felony treason. This is additionally supported by Article 12, Section 8 of the Colorado Constitution. And we have, looks like a Supreme Court reference from Cooper versus Aaron. Any judge who does not comply with his or her oath to the Constitution and engages in acts in violation of the supreme law of the land, the judge is engaged in acts of treason. We hereby acknowledge your guilty plea to multiple counts of felony treason under 18 U.S. Code 2381. All proceedings are deemed acts of treason as you have failed to provide the certified delegation of authority order required from the Superior Court to establish jurisdiction in this matter with a bill of attainder number listed but redacted. Despite repeated notifications, someone has failed to furnish this document for examination and continues perhaps that says to violate due process of law, I'm not sure, thereby violating innumerable amendments and rights. And then we have another pretty significant component of redaction. Coming down here a little bit, we hereby accept your concession to cease serving as a judicial officer. This affidavit of fact and notice of default judgment and void judgment is entered into the record. All claims, petitions, suits, and filings with third-party corporations regarding misrepresented attainders are hereby disregarded, expunged, and any subsequent fraudulent judgments declared void. Despite repeated legal notice, someone has failed to produce oath of office, bond, insurance information, and therefore concedes to guilt for being an unidentified, belligerent, transnational combatant working as an agent for a principal without a proper registration statement as required under 22 U.S. Code Section 611. Furthermore, these violations equate to unlawful occupation of the office, which is in violation of Executive Order 13848. Refer to Exhibit 6 and Exhibit 8 for further details. And then we have another significant redaction. The commission of severe criminal conduct, as defined under 18 U.S. Code 2381, is being executed by an unidentified individual acting on behalf of a foreign principal while impersonating a member of the judiciary. This individual poses a substantial threat to national security. Therefore, it is recommended that these documents serve as an indictment for someone, requiring them to undergo an expedited military tribunal and sentencing for all violations under the provisions of the declared national emergency pursuant to Executive Order 13818, 15 U.S. Code 1541, and in accordance with the War Powers Resolution under 50 U.S. Code Section 1550. And then it concludes with the conscientious statement for the Constitutional Republic of the United States. I certify under penalties of perjury that each statement herein is true, factual, and accurate to the fullest extent of my knowledge and authority. So help me God, with my quantum autograph and trademark sigil marked by my right forefingerprint. And then again, we have the document signed in terra firma jurisdiction, a reference to the Universal Commercial Code there, and then multiple counter-terrorist operators listed as part and party to the generation of this notice of default judgment. So it's absolutely fascinating then, and it makes a ton of sense. Let's assume on the basis here that there is some truth to this document. It would make a tremendous amount of sense here in the United States of America for that question that so many American patriots have, which is, why does it take so long? If you consider the sprawling landscape of the U.S. judiciary, from the county magistrate level judge all the way up through the federal level and the various U.S. federal circuits, you have hundreds and hundreds of judicial representatives just in the form of judges alone. That doesn't include their staffers. That doesn't always include attorneys that are studying with them or clerking for them. And it certainly does not include your elected representatives who serve as a part of the fiscal court outside of that. So just to audit the judiciary is a Leviathan task that would take tremendous amounts of time. And if you also have to provide a merciful and compassionate common law focused, basis for this, and allow them the opportunity to cure, advise them of what the issue and the problem is, then that process also takes time, because they must be allowed the time to adequately respond and to seek to cure if they choose to come on board and acknowledge that they have unconsciously, but nonetheless, very assuredly acting on behalf of a foreign government here in the United States, which is an act of insurrection and would qualify an individual as becoming a domestic enemy of the Constitution during times of war.
Fascinating document. It just has the tune of so many things going through my head with who could have written this, whoever has written this, what tie-in do they have with the counter-terrorism operations? People that are listed there, well, at least we know that there's 2 counter-terrorism operators that are listed there. One of my first questions was, are they a private type entity as well, the counter-terrorism operators, or are they possibly from another agency or branch of government?
That's very, very difficult to say. And, sort of one of the more pointed and multi-level questions about it. I think that, truthfully, the possibility or potential could go either direction. Russia has proven pretty openly to the world that utilization of mercenary forces in this process to accomplish ends that your standard Ministry of Defense or your standard Pentagon chain of command for here, for reference here in the United States, wouldn't be able to do due to red tape or bureaucratic restrictions or whatever. They've proven that to be a very effective outlet, and it would not surprise me whatsoever if we had recalled operators that were formerly involved in the United States military services or armed services, but in the form of being private contractors or special advisors rather than active operators on the payroll of the DoD. And indeed, you would need to provide some amount of administrative shielding, not only for their physical security, but also for cyber hacking and cyber infiltration into extreme compartmented operations, which is what I believe these things that are occurring in Colorado and other states, I believe them to be that nature. With regards to, the potential that they could be from agency or from a number of different agencies, that's absolutely factual, because we have a number of continuity directives that were issued not only prior to Trump, but that have been issued even since the Manchurian Biden installation, the most recent one on the 4th of June, just earlier this month. And they describe and outline procedures and protocols for continuity operations that involve supporting agencies and supporting operations coming out of the CIA and the DHS, the FBI, the DOJ, and others. And so, seeing the holistic approach here and then cross-referencing the type of work that we are doing, we are blending, I think, military law with common law in some regard. We're utilizing military law as the vector to return the world to common law. And in order to do that, we have to, it's almost like we have to suspend and expand authority in the one sense, and then make sure to only use 10% or 15% or whatever of that authority is truly necessary to return the world to balance, because it has to be fully rebalanced, not by the military, but by the movement of we the people. And I think that's one of the reasons we've seen, simultaneous with these types of silent operations occurring in the background, we've seen a tremendous amount of overt awakening pills just horse-fed one right after the other to patriots and citizen culture groups worldwide for the last 4.5 years.
Yeah, I find it interesting that the common law movement sort of sprung up. However, not really something that I found obvious in the Q drops. It was just like a natural evolution for those who were seeking truth and looking for a way to negotiate this situation in a peaceful yet lawful way. So, anyone have any other points on this document? Do you want to start to revisit some of those finer points there? If you want to bring that back up, Beck.
Yeah. I find it really interesting that they're focusing on the common law Is it to waken people up to, there's so many that are at the moment researching it and diving into it and wanting to know answers to so many things, and how to, you know, do a trust, how to do the bonds, how to do so much. Is this like the Pandora's box that's going to open up to tell people that they're not crazy, that this is the way to go, and that we have been the whole human trafficked with all those executive orders that are sprung up also in this document? It's just, there's so much there. It's crazy. There's just a lot there. So,
well, and it's a difficult prediction, I think, to make with the movement of the law and the reception of the law, because the law is the purest expression of we the people holding one another in fairness and indemnification, and I think as the object of love, but also in a firm, reinforcing ways. We seek to better the collective and better the community, much in the way that a parent would look at the child and say, I love you, but you can't act that way. And I think the same attitude is applied at the grand common law scale if we were to macro think about this for a moment. But you talk about the Pandora's box and what this opens up and how far this goes. I think the basis of law and the basis of finance or economy are two things that we have been essentially lied to by omission over the last 200 years or so, because it's been most advantageous to the British Crown and all of the bankers representing the various European royal families for the last 400 to 500 years for us to not have that information. In the United States of America, we're not taught anything about the law in high school, for example, except that you have to obey the law and that you have to listen to the police officers and the authority and everyone above you and over you. And even in law school, while you learn, about the different types of law, most U.S. law schools don't cover all of the various factions of law that can be emitted and adhered to in a society. And essentially, no one is taught that a great deal of that corporate law or that fictitious law is actually utilized in pulpits and spaces where the common and natural law, constitutional law, reigns supreme and is supposed to be the governing attitude by which we measure things against itself. So unlocking this box is, I think, tantamount to unlocking the power of the human being. Under common law, under true constitutional republicanism, the individual holds all of the power, but the individual does need the participation of at least a couple of members of the community to move the judicial process into action. If one is going to level an accusation, one has to be able to prove the accusation to two or more witnesses, and then we can begin an investigation. But without that, one is simply treated as crying wolf. And I think that's a fair attitude that has always been applied in the annals of human history and human events. If it's easily provable, then it's not difficult for two or three other people to find it as well, or to come on board with it, I should say, as well. So when we talk about, the judiciary and the common law attitude of it, what has changed, of course, is that the attitude within the U.S. corporate system post 1871 very much became where and how are you guilty, and how can we utilize that to establish case law. It's never been, since that hostile takeover post-U.S. Civil War, it's never been about the innocence of the accused. It's been about the commercial valuation that the accused offers to the court. Sometimes the accused can settle and take a plea deal, for example. The court still gets paid. Sometimes the accused goes to jail and then is remitted into public custody, corporate custody, really, and then proceeds to do whatever manner of slave labor or very low compensated labor that they do on behalf of that corporate entity. And so the state, the corporation, benefits from that also. It all comes back to the same hydra, the same belly of the beast. And so auditing the U.S. judiciary, just I think as we should, as citizenry, we should be taking account of all of the judicial processes and protocol systems that we have in our localities. That would be one of the necessary components if you were truly going to return the land to a common law basis and remove the financial and legal corruption that has obfuscated, the entirety of the discussion. And it would make a lot of sense that we would see something like that being the Pandora's box to ignite patriots within their own communities to say, well, I lost family, or I lost friends, or I lost a job or a home or a loved one or something of significant and material value because I was coerced during the pandemic, or because I was forced into an experimental injection, or because I was robbed of my livelihood because I refused an experimental injection. And so these common law affidavits, again, there has to be a basis to them, and they have to be stipulations of facts, not feelings, but they are very powerful, and they lie in the hands of all of we the people everywhere.
Yeah. And that's where that executive order 13818 comes in. And then you've got the two witnesses here on that document, basically witnessing the living man that's here on this this affidavit, which is pretty incredible.
What's one of the bullet points that sticks out to you most on this document, SG? What's one of the telling signs here that really piques your interest, that you want to dig into when you get a chance?
Well, one of the things that I find extremely compelling was what we were discussing prior to coming on today, which is the document itself has appeared in the online space within a 15 to 25 day period of a number of vacancies opening up within the Colorado court system here in the United States of America. And when we talk about the document having been provided multiple times, I mean, something was evidently provided in multiple attempts. The document references that. I'm assuming, again, that those are, notices of a violation and then being given opportunities to cure. But after an amount of time has passed and that opportunity to cure window is gone, if you are engaged in a violation of a national emergency, not a state emergency, but a national emergency to which the U.S. Military Armed Services is responding, and Executive Order 13818 activated a number of military components in early 2018 in response to that executive order, then you would place yourself squarely in the crosshairs of a larger scale military operation seeking to mitigate and destroy all examples of severe human rights abuses and corruption. And that is exactly what acting on behalf of a foreign power, which is an act of insurrection, that's what that would do. If you were an acting member of the U.S. judiciary, because again, it would make you essentially an imposter. It would make you an impersonator of the constitutional judiciary system, but not an agent and a representative of we the people.
Yeah. And if you flick through, if you're interested in having a bit of a dig in here, we chose Colorado to have a look at because that's in the document. And we've got a bunch of vacancies here that are recent. If you have a look at the dates, the first vacancy seems to come up at around the 22nd of May. So that's very recent. We're filming this on the 17th of June, 2024. And so we've got a bunch of vacancies here. So we've got one affidavit that we're looking at that is addressing one person that could have a cascading effect. That one affidavit could take a bunch with it, or there's more like it as well. So that's just been a fascinating look into the possibilities that we've got ahead of us at the moment on a closing of the operation. If we're at the judicial level now, then we're in a good position, I can imagine. If we're bringing the judicial system to justice itself in this way, then we could be in a really close part of revealing the rest of the war that we're in, being that it's a irregular war that we're in, an information war.
I find it interesting that they've had multiple attempts at this, and the document was dated in May, filed. I think it was in May on the document, and we've got a lot of vacancies in that period. First thing comes to my mind is that does the system, that are they working behind the scenes without the public coming up in the uproar of it all You got a third attempt, and all these job vacancies are popping up within 2 weeks span. Sounds like they're trying to clean house in the background before it comes to public, and they cause some kind of craziness within the people in the system trying to fight all this. It's they can see the problem ahead. Well, let's try and deal with it and have a better outcome. But what we can see is that things are moving forward. We just really have to look behind the curtain and try and speculate on these actions on where we're going. The court systems are getting found out around the world. So, we are moving in the right direction, most definitely. And there's a lot of people out there pushing this stuff in their own communities and states and countries. So, we're all definitely moving in the right direction.
One of the violations that this person has been found guilty of was that they were conspiring to injure as well. So that's 1 to 2 more. I think it was USC 241 that I looked up that was about 2 or more people conspiring to injure, or that that USC goes further than that, but it gives an indication that you're not looking at a single person, that this affidavit is probably dealing with the one person, but that person is also conspiring with others. How did you feel about that, SG?
Well, in an indirect way, the document that we were looking at a moment ago directly states that is true. It cites both extrinsic and collateral fraud. Collateral, not just meaning in the investment sense, posing collateral, but also in the sense that you are collaborating with someone. You are collateral in nature in your conspiracy to commit whatever fraud or injury has occurred. And again, with the court systems in particular, the maritime admiralty systems that are at play, masquerading as common law courts of record here in the United States of America, are primarily commercial instruments. And so if we look back at that document, it not only stated that it was to serve as an indictment for an expedited military tribunal, but it was also to be used as a debt instrument against the person, whoever the judicial agent or officer, ostensibly a judge of some kind, is being directed at. And it's very unlikely that at a county level, with the way that community law tends to function here in the States in particular, it's very
Dale, are you there? Anyone else?
So when we talk about conspiring to injure with others, I think that we're talking about, this potential judicial audit could lead into very quickly actually could lead into the public executive spaces, because you have a lot of overlap between the executive branches and their ability to influence the judicial offices. In fact, it's actually the president of the United States here in the US that gets to appoint a new justice for the Supreme Court. So that's sort of your macro example of how intertwined the two branches really are. And if you have the judicial system fully corrupted, and then that corruption is caught out in the snare of a national emergency that puts it square in the crosshairs of the armed services, they would have expanded authority as a result of that audit to go as far as where that conspiracy to deprive rights actually began. And I fully believe that they will eventually find themselves in the public executive official space as well.
Who is it? And who has been taken down with this one? And it just leaves me with a few questions that I think some of those links might lead you to. You might get a bit of an idea there, but it might go, this might just be a one affidavit that leads to an example for many. So it's a very encouraging affidavit to read, SG. I really appreciate you sharing that with us. Is there anything else you wish to say on that front?
Well, I think I would close that segment of the call off by saying that, we are trying to corroborate, and for the moment, it does remain speculative, and we should take that with a few grains of salt in each hand. But provided that it is true, it provides the basis for one of the most brilliant strategies that I think has ever been conceived, and it was far beyond my ability to conceptualize at a macro scale. To utilize the judiciary as the vector to introduce an audit of essentially what amounts to domestic treachery here in the United States of America would ensnare everyone along the poison river, because the judiciary is the frontal facing component of that corruption. The judiciary are the gatekeepers for the broader corruptions that are behind the manipulation of the same. So if you're able to establish a true audit of that system, of that closed circuit, open circuit system in the background, that incestuous open system in the background, it would lead you out of the judicial system, again, potentially into the executive, and certainly into the private sector, where there has been lobbying, blackmailing, and changing of monies and hands outside of what's allowable by U.S. law.
And a little note there that says that this crime has been perpetrated against his family. That was interesting too. SG, you've got a massive dump of information that you said you've got this document from. Is there anything that you've been able to glean from that dump that you wish to share for us at the moment? Or would you like to hit another subject? Because, yep, there's a lot going on in the world right now.
Well, you talk about the various things that I'm trying to sort through and sift through. Some of it is to establish validity and to see if it even sounds remotely accurate. Frankly, I think some of it probably is purposeful disinformation that's abjectly not true. So I'm doing my best to try and feel out what seems to be true. And supporting the document that we were just looking at, I put out, it was either yesterday or the day before, on the social media platforms from True Social and X, formerly Twitter, one of the other documents that I had worked through, which was a one-page notice to sheriff's offices that had been issued, and it looked like it had been issued potentially to a sheriff's office in the U.S. state of Michigan. But the document itself, unfortunately, does not say. The file name hints at a potential recipient, but the document doesn't state. But the sheriff office is essentially being put on notice, again, by two counterterrorist operators, that the local combined county court system has failed to establish lawful jurisdiction. And if the sheriff's office, carries out any detention orders, any restraining orders or detention orders that are issued by that combined county courts, they will be caught up in the military's audit, and they also will be charged with capital felony treason. So it's fascinating then that the lawful elected representatives of the locality would essentially be given a merciful heads up. Hey, these individuals masquerading as judicial officers over here are actually foreign insurrectionists. And if you serve any orders or edicts that they issue from their bench, if you act on their behalf, you will be considered as acting in concert with agents to a foreign principal, and you will also be charged with felony treason. I find that absolutely compelling, and also very, very astute and merciful of whatever military faction or militarized factions conducting operations on behalf of JSOC would actually be doing.
Just define JSOC for us.
So JSOC stands for U.S. Joint Special Operations Command. JSOC came into being as a result of President Kennedy's creation of Special Operations Command in the 1960s. Special Operations Command was granted combatant command status at some point in recent memory. Forgive me, I don't recall exactly when that was. It's not been terribly long ago. And Special Operations Command has been heavily involved, I believe, in worldwide alliance operations, accomplishing a host of different goals. Some of those goals for the moment would be the destruction of the U.S. petrodollar, the baiting out of U.S. CIA assets in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Central African nations, the attacking of tunneling infrastructure in Iceland and across the northern British Isles arena, the attacking of organ harvesting networks in eastern Turkey and in northwestern India along the Pakistan, Iranian, India border. So that would be, excuse me, one of the overarching combatant commands that would be involved in the types of operations that we would like to think would be occurring in this deep state war, this war between, good guys and bad guys that we kind of, conceive in our mind just for simple terms. And JSOC would also have to have a very heavily involved component in whatever domestic operations were happening in the United States of America, because those operations would have to be so expertly conducted and so precise and clandestine in nature that the standard armed services battery, the standard field personnel that the other armed services bring to the table, would just simply not have the training and the fortitude and the disposition to carry out the types of missions that I think need to be carried out. And sort of in an ancillary fashion supporting that component, we have press releases going back 2 or 3 years now, multiple press releases from places like Military Times and military.com discussing massive supposed training operations occurring in large metro and even in entire stateside areas here in the United States of America without the knowledge of the local county and state government. And in many cases, the governors weren't even apprised that elements of their National Guard would be supporting these JSOC training operations. So that tells me that there, again, you have active operations of a very clandestine, shielded nature occurring. And the entire goal of things right now is to put out enough information that the public and patriots who are paying attention have something to sink their teeth into, but not so much that we compromise what is still, I believe, an ongoing audit of the U.S. domestic system.
So much happening. If people can't see things happening by now, by God, there's just so much out there.
Actually, speaking about seeing things happening, what's the vibe over your side of the realm, mate, with Russia being right next door? You see a lot of things intertwining. They've got the US are parked up right next to them as well, and other countries for their, the war games over there, the drills, as they say.
Well, it's fascinating that Red October has come early this year. And one of the things that is very apparent on the sentiment right now of the U.S. culture base and the general societal demographic is people are sort of split down the ideological divide of understanding what's going on with Russia. And I think we would expect that at this point along the way. The Patriot faction and the Awakened Patriot faction in particular has grown so rapidly and so magnanimously that you now have destabilization with the overarching viewpoint. You have this split viewpoint. So on the one hand, I would characterize it as a segment of the population still pretty sizable. I would estimate at least 4 or 5 in 10 is looking at this and seeing the obvious writing on the wall that this is a Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0 style event. And there's a lot of vitriol and animosity towards the Manchurian installation and the general apathy of the Uniparty as a result of that. But not a whole lot of hopefulness and optimism coming out of that particular group of folks, at least not yet. At the same time, you have on the other side of that an enormous faction of awakened patriots, and I would characterize this even as very very well-known podcast and alternative media voices with several millions of followers on platforms like X and Rumble and others that have come out and said that this is fundamentally a good thing because it's getting the attention of the American populace in a way that has not been seen really since the very concerning days of the Cold War. And it also shows that the Russian Navy is in the Western Hemisphere conducting active operations, and they are in some cases not actively communicating with components of the United States Navy. And I love the armed services of the United States and have the utmost respect for all of them, but I am willing to acknowledge that several of them have very deep infiltration at the flag officer and command and control level, especially at the level just above what I think you would have, active field command, where you finally hit that desk jockey level, brigadier general, major general, etc. There's a lot of infiltration that has occurred in the standard armed services, and the U.S. Navy is the oldest service. So, appreciating that and looking at that and looking at what the Navy lost with September 11, 2001, not only in documentation and intelligence, but military personnel that were on site in the office of ONI when it was struck by the missile, it makes a lot of sense then that the Russians would not be so keen to communicate as much with the Navy. And I maintain that they are communicating with Special Operations Command and other secret services in the background, because I believe Putin in his Tucker Carlson interview in early February actually told us that without telling us that.
Well, Russia's not just involved over in Cuba. They got what is Egypt and them in the Mediterranean Sea as well at the same time. You've got Putin meeting up with North Korea all at the same time. We're seeing other things in the Middle East with US dollar contracts and the petrodollar and all that kind of stuff emerging as well.
Yeah, the shift of power seems to have occurred, at least on the financial front. The BRICS organization has become a lot more clearer on where they're at now, and the de-dollarization seemed to happen around the same time. Well, the de-dollarization is what the BRICS is trying to achieve. I meant the petrodollar agreement not being renewed with Saudi Arabia. That just seems to be quite timely that BRICS are organized during the time that the petrodollar dies off. And I guess that's going to have quite a large impact on the financial system in America. And it seems like the rest of the world has been swept up in an organization that for the most part would have their backs, or at least at the moment that's what it seems to be. What's your take on where we're at on that front at the moment, SG?
Well, it's interesting you should bring up the events of June 9th, because I'm not sure the patriots out there are understanding and really comprehending just how significant an event that was. The choice on behalf of Riyadh to not renew that agreement amounts to the largest economic news that the average American citizen has heard in his or her lifetime. We have seen now the nail. This is the first nail in the chest of the petrodollar. We've now drilled in the coffin, and the coffin's complete. Now we're actually putting the nails into the vampire. And Saudi Arabia has been traditionally one of the largest trade partners of the U.S. in oil-based. Saudi Arabia is also a major junction of or has been, in recent decades, a major junction of very, very dark occultic practices, actually, that go back to the House of Saud. And so seeing that disconnection from the Federal Reserve System and the petrodollar tells me two things. One, whoever is actually calling the shots in Riyadh on behalf of the Saudi Arabian government is no friend of the deep state any longer. And I would argue that the event in Vegas, I believe it was in 2017 with the Vegas mass shooting, and the fact that bin Salman was there on site and was actually intercepted by President Trump and essentially saved from assassination by President Trump, it would make a lot of sense in the Saudi cultural code that bin Salman would owe Trump a life debt. And something like what we've now seen happening with the petrodollar and the failure of Saudi Arabia to renew that agreement, that I think that we could be seeing the manifestation of what type of debt was to be called upon at such and such a point in the future. The other thing that it does outside of that is it absolutely ensures that the worldwide energy markets will ditch the dollar, perhaps for another currency, but certainly for an independent representation, at least in the moment. And the petrodollar will rapidly disconnect now from the remainder of the Middle East, from the remainder of Northern Africa. I think you'll see a disconnect primarily from the European countries last, or very near last, and then the US, of course, and North America will be last. But to help that process along, I think we're going to see a number of sledgehammer blows coming from essentially an expanded Middle East conflict, with Turkey entering the war on behalf of an Arab coalition in the coming weeks and months, and with an expanded Pacific conflict with, I believe, a war breaking out simultaneously on the Korean Peninsula, the Philippines, and in Taiwan, and potentially involving the Japanese Navy.
Oh, you just nailed it on the head. And my brain was going. We're seeing a lot of naval operations, or drills, as they like to say, which are operations. They're strategically positioning themselves globally for what, a World War III scare event around the corner. You got the US presidential election coming up. They've got a few options: a World War III or another pandemic or some sort. Which I don't see that happening, because there's too many people waking up in uproar from the last few years we've endeavored. But it's definitely leading up to something big. Do you see, and what's your opinion on the lead up on that perspective? The other deep state, they're going to try and counteract the election and cause some kind of scare event.
I think without question we can expect a number of different scare events that I think will culminate in what humanity will recall as the scare event of our time. And World War III, setup, we're already sort of there, right? We can see the commission now of French forces on the ground in Ukraine. Russia has now publicly acknowledged to the world through their Ministry of Foreign Affairs that they're aware that the French have personnel on the ground in Ukraine. It's not been that long ago that one of the directorates for Russian intelligence came out. One of the directors for the Directorate of Russian Intelligence came out and said that they're very well aware that NATO personnel have been engaged in literal hand-to-hand combat with Russian forces on the ground on behalf of Ukrainian brigades, often leading these brigades personally themselves, because they've not had enough time to train the begrudged, reluctant, quite frankly, scared out of their mind Ukrainian conscripts who do not want to be involved in the war on behalf of Kiev. And we've seen it again, an explosion of defections in the recent weeks leading up to where we're at now. Another explosion of defections, I think, in preparation for a larger Russian offensive that's going to move on Kiev before the end of July. Now, you're talking about, various things that they can do to disrupt the election here in the United States. This is, of course, one of them. I personally think that we will see a pandemic 2.0 style attempt and probably an expansion of world hostility all around the same time, sort of as a bell ringer for humankind, but also to accomplish vast amounts of expanded military authority. Militaries from 45 nations will be in Paris, for example, for the Parisian Olympics. I personally think the Parisian Olympics could be the scapegoat vector that is used and blamed for some sort of Western world pandemic 2.0 style attempt. I think it's extremely possible that we see, and matter of fact, I think it's actually likely that we're going to see a major destabilizing event internally here in the United States that will make 9/11 look like sort of like target practice at the beginning of the operation, the beginning of the campaign. President Trump has told us that there's 100% chance that we're going to have a terrorist attack. He didn't say 99. He didn't say it's probably going to happen. He said twice on air in a 3-week span earlier this spring that it's a 100% chance. And there's virtually nothing that Trump has said with that kind of certainty in this process that we've not seen play out. As a matter of fact, the adage "Trump was right" has now become kind of like a calling card hashtag online because of that. So looking at the various forces that seem to all be converging themselves, and then appreciating these background movements where the Federal Reserve dollar is essentially it's like we've wrapped the boa constrictor around its own neck and it's just tightening itself into extinction. And we're also simultaneously conducting a full-scale study of treachery here in the United States and probably also in the Western world at the same time that you have large-scale grassroots population groups across all state and provincial arenas, primarily in the Western world and the global North, that are moving into action and evidencing their attitude towards not only unity but the opposite of what this corrupt elected class in the former Commonwealth realms is actually trying to push forward. And I think you have a formula there that it leads us to the obvious conclusion being that they'll do anything that they can to try and hold on to power. But by the time this process is over, there will be absolutely no hope left for this classification of individual. And everyone that is involved in true criminality that caused material harm to we the people, there will be a reckoning and a judgment coming that they will not be able to avoid.
It's interesting you say that about the Paris Olympics, because I remember there was something going back February about watch the water over that way. There was something about the Olympic swimming in, I forget where it was, Celine, or I can't even remember exactly where it was. I'm trying to find the article. Something about the river. They reckon they were going to basically put something in the water there that was going to set off the next pandemic. I'm not sure if anyone remembers that.
Sorry, I don't.
I'm just trying to find that.
Well, what you're talking about is, and I don't know, I don't think I wrote the article that you're referencing, but I talked a little bit about that concept in an earlier audio file, and I don't remember exactly when it was, but it seems the perfect modus operandi if you're trying to create a large super spreader narrative in the Western world mindset. What better way to do that than an extremely large scale sporting event? And what is interesting about the sporting event component of it is that we saw a sporting event, granted it was a militarized sporting event, but a sporting event nonetheless, that occurred, excuse me, exactly 2 months prior to the lab leak out of China, leaking the Ukrainian-made virus out into the world. And that militarized event was a sporting event occurring right there in Wuhan province. So looking at the Parisian Olympics and also their absolute bloodlust for symbolism that these occultic zealots at the top just can't get enough of. If we look back to the Dark Ages and the plague that occurred in Western and Central Europe, the bubonic plague that wiped out 2/3 of the population, it was introduced in two major components to the European continent. One of those components was the Italian South and the south of the continent in South Europe. And then the other major component was actually the port of Marseille, France. And it ravaged the French countryside in those days and caused extreme loss of life. Two or three for every, I think it was 2 or 3 for every 7 in various villages across the entirety of the French countryside. So it makes a lot of sense then that we would see another disease style event occurring in France at such a time as this, and really what amounts to a seminal and a pivotal moment throughout human history, because that introduction of the plague into Gaul in those days facilitated the plague into the British Isles and really allowed for the maximization of punishment, if you will, against the peoples of the world through biological warfare. And we have diary records still in existence today that describe certain members of the elected class purposefully poisoning water wells with plague-ridden rodents. So they were waging biological warfare and biological terrorism against us even 700 years ago. And it's time, I think, that we bring all of this to a stop. And what better way to do that than capitalizing on their symbolism ahead of time?
100%. Yeah. Have you heard about the Russian special forces as well that have launched a full-scale assault on the, I think it's Rostov prison detention center? A whole heap of ISIS terrorists are holding the prison guards hostage at the moment. Have you heard anything about that going around, SG?
I have. I tracked that event hitting the narrative space in real time. I believe it was today. And as of early this morning, US time, we've had all of the terrorists dispensed with and all of the hostages saved. It's amazing what happens when there's a common sense approach to that type of behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. Was there anything else, guys? Anything else that we want to finish up with SG? I mean, we could sit here for hours, SG, but I know it's Father's Day, so happy Father's Day, and we need to get you back to your family.
Well, I appreciate that, very much. At the end of the day, my only closing statement, I think, would be that, we have evidence to show that we are winning, but it's not going to be spoon-fed to us. And that's sort of the nature of this entire journey. We have to be proactive to some degree. We have to be involved. We have to be engaged. It's not just enough to know about it, we have to move upon it. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should move upon it from a state of reactivity, or that we shouldn't think about it and reflect on it and decide purposefully what we want to do with the information. But we are reclaiming the space of our minds and our thoughts first and foremost. We're reclaiming our spiritual identity, I think, is the overarching, most important takeaway to the lesson here.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, we have to be, I think, motivated to some degree, and we have to be willing to acknowledge that things will point us in the direction showing the type of progress that we want to see and that we hope to see in the world. But we do have to be involved in going in that direction on purpose.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah, I really take from that not to be reactionary. Yeah, and on that Paris front, also the capability of that possible plague event to actually be a serious one, and not to have actual complacency over where we were at from COVID, because if you were really quite evil, you could make us complacent with COVID and realizing that it was more of a flu. And if we were to assume once again that this was the same thing, that we could quite easily fall into illness, and realizing that this is probably a biological weapon too late. So I would promote a lot of caution around that, and just also not to be reactionary or in fear, but also just to have your head on a swivel and to just really take in the information that surrounds any event like that very carefully, and trying to analyze it not from a fear mindset.
Well said,
yeah.
Pirate. Yeah. Well, we thank you so much, SG. We'll stop recording now, but we'll definitely wait for some more documents. You're more than happy to share them with us, and we can help you research them like we have been. But yeah, thank you so much
to the next file.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Dale.
Well,
thanks, SG. Go ahead, SG. Sorry.
I was just going to say it's always an honor, and I appreciate the conversations very much, because they're the fireside chats of our time. And we always historically have gotten one another through together. And I think that's the beauty of the Great Awakening itself, is that people are forced to drop their preconceptions. They're forced to drop the artificial division. They're forced to step back from their political or social divides. And they're forced to acknowledge that there are some things that just transcend the spirituality component of the human being too much to ignore. And we're at that point, I think, collectively realizing that in the world today. And I appreciate you all having me.
You're welcome. Thank you. So I'll just stop recording now. Thanks, SG.
Over, SJ. Thank you, brother.